I'm your moderator for today, DJ. And tonight's conversation is very urgent. So we see that the Philippine military budget has surged to 430.87 billion pesos in 2026, 40 billion of which is allotted for the AFP modernization or the Armed Forces of the Philippines modernization. Now we are seeing a new forward base being surveyed in Batanes. You could actually Google that, Mahatao Batanes Forward Operating Base. And our government has recently approved 500 plus um, joint military activities with the United States for this year. Actually, 500 plus has been the go-to number for the past 3 years running. And tensions in the West Philippine Sea are escalating with 55 Chinese vessels, which have been recorded only this January. Okay. So in this context, we think that we have to hashtag peace, not militarization, hashtag sovereignty now, hashtag youth for peace, and hashtag frontline voices. We hope that you can use these hashtags when you post or talk about our conversation today and in your socials. We are likewise recording this to be streamed in YouTube. This learning session is in cooperation with the International Peace Bureau. So our forum now is entitled Great Power Rivalry, Small Nations at Risk, Unpacking Trump's 2025 National Security Strategy, and the Island Chain Strategy. So we're gonna launch a quick poll. So do you think that the new U.S. national security strategy increases risk for small nations like the Philippines? You can, the options are yes, somewhat, not really, unsure. So I'm just gonna wait for our friends inside to see what the temperature is in the room. What do they think? The votes are still coming in and it's still overwhelmingly yes. Okay. Let's just wait for one more minute for anybody who wants to vote on our poll. Right. Okay, so the results are yes. 95% of us here said yes. Okay, so let's move on to so this is the pulse. Oops. Right. So now this is our pulse now for our start, no? So now we're gonna call on our guest speaker, our research speaker for this forum. We are going to be joined by Joseph Gerson. He is the co-president of the International Peace Bureau and the president of Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security USA. How are you doing, Joseph?
I'm doing pretty well. I'm doing pretty well. Thank you for welcoming me.
Yeah. So I hope your topic is as hot as it is freezing where you are.
Okay, so I'll jump in now.
Right.
Okay.
So
Okay. All right. I'm
our
jumping
turn.
in. Okay, so I want to thank Cora Fapros and DJ for inviting me to join you at this early hour here in the US. I also want to say that on the screen I saw Roland Simbalon, and I just want to wave hi to an old friend and comrade. It's been much too long since I had the privilege of working closely with the Philippine movement. I have to say my strongest memories are of being in Manila just after the EDSA revolution and being with courageous democratic activists as they poured out of prisons where they had been tortured and they shared their terrifying experiences with the media. I also recall the first post-dictatorship meeting of the Anti-Basis Coalition and a march on the U.S. Embassy as the campaign to oust U.S. bases neared its climax, and the panic that ensued when armed police thugs attacked us. That was a long time ago, and I'm anything but an expert on Philippine politics and policies. To the degree that I can, I've been tracking tensions and the confrontations in the West Philippine Sea with China, the deepening U.S.-Philippine military collaborations, and Japan's growing military commitments and roles in the region. I should also say that, I'm speaking to the I'm speaking from the very traumatized United States, where we have Trump seeking to grasp the dictatorial powers far beyond what Marcos exercised. And our resistance here is widespread. Just to say, the city of Minneapolis, where obviously not only innocent immigrants are being rounded up and abused, but there's been sort of mass resistance, but also, as you likely know, two murders of courageous, nonviolent people trying to act in solidarity with their neighbors. So anyhow, my topic is the U.S. national security strategy as it relates to a considerable degree in the Philippines. And needless to say that when it was released in November, it shocked both U.S. and international establishments. What was implied in the strategy as an assault on the post-Cold War disorder has been devastatingly delivered in the assault on the UN Charter. I need a little water here, sorry. In the assault on the Cold War, on the UN Charter, the Bretton Woods system, and with challenges and threats made by the U.S. Trump invaded Venezuela, illegally captured its president, and impounded the country's oil in order to starve Cuba of energy and to topple its government. Another goal was to consolidate U.S. control over the Americas, including pushing China out of Western markets. We've also had the creation of Trump's so-called Board of Peace, which is designed to transform Gaza into Trump's personal fiefdom, while also creating a new international body to challenge its legitimacy, the U.S. legitimacy, and its roles. If you want to look at who signed on to the Board of Peace, which countries, you'll see it's a kind of rogues gallery of nasty governments. Trump created a massive crisis with his threats to militarily and economically seize Greenland. He has alienated Europe, including his former right-wing allies there, and he is undermining nearly a century of transatlantic integration, while weakening, if not sabotaging, the NATO alliance. That said, as we saw from Canadian Prime Minister Carney's trade agreement with China, his speech in Davos urging unity among middle powers, and British Prime Minister Starmer's visit to Beijing, longtime U.S. allies are beginning to hedge and diversify their strategic relations. From a distance, the failed uprising in Iran, with its terrible death toll in the thousands, is shocking us all. The U.S. and Israel may have had hands in that failed commendable resistance, but as we meet, and as with Venezuela, Trump has dispatched a massive armada, he says bigger than the one to Venezuela, in order to intimidate and possibly attack Iran to coerce its foreign and nuclear policies into a change or maybe even regime change. And here in the U.S., as I said before, with Trump's brutal military and anti-immigrant invasions of several American cities, and now with the murder of innocent protesters, we may be seeing the still tenuous unraveling of Trump's base and regime. It's interesting to see the number of Republicans who have spoken out against it. But we are a long way from ousting Trump, and protecting our rights here. And much depends on whether our midterm congressional elections next November are actually held, and if so, if the outcomes can be defended. I was asked to address several questions: how the U.S. has revised its geopolitical priorities, the increasingly transactional nature of U.S. alliances, and to situate the Philippines as a frontline state in the first island chain. Let me begin with that last one. One of my clearest memories from my college days is of a lecture by Professor Jules Davids, who we later learned was the principal ghostwriter for John F. Kennedy's book, Profiles in Courage, in his course on U.S. diplomatic history. In the late 1890s, when the U.S. was desperate to access what Davis described as the holy grail of capitalism, the China market, in order to produce its way out of an economic depression, Davis described what was then seen as the necessity of gaining access to the maritime stepping stones to Asia. That was a time of steamships, and they needed coaling stations. Foremost among them was the Philippines. Davis described Subic Bay as a perfect, deep, and round harbor within easy jumping distance from China. And that's what I saw when I first went to Subic. Thus, the U.S. seized what was then the Spanish colony and made it its own. Throughout the Cold War and post-Cold War periods, and continuing today, control of Philippine ports, waters, and airspace have served as a geopolitical prize. They provide a base of operations to dominate the strategically important South China Sea with its trade routes and seabed mineral resources. It also serves as a kind of a cork, preventing Chinese forces from breaking through the first island chain and into the wider Pacific Ocean. Loss of control of these regions would profoundly weaken the U.S. military and its economic empire. Today, the U.S. State Department tells us that, quote, the Philippines has long been at the forefront of preserving what it terms the free and open regional order in Southeast Asia, and that the Mutual Defense Treaty remains as the foundation for the close security cooperation, which includes the focus on Philippine military modernization. It also includes working for the interoperability of weapon systems and technologies. As DJ was saying, the now 500 plus joint military operations, and the more than $1 billion of arms sales to Manila. Last summer, we had I'm going to mispronounce this, the Kamandag 9 joint U.S., Philippine, Japanese, South Korean exercise to practice maritime strikes. And the U.S. is returning to Subic to produce and store ammunition and likely more there. And recently, our pathetic U.S. Secretary of War, Hegseth, and Philippine Defense Secretary Teodor reaffirmed the military alliance. Then to the strategy. After being on life support for much of the post-Cold War era, as Prime Minister Carney said in Davos, Pax America is over. Dead. Past. History. Trump's national security strategy, published in November, is an attempt by a right-wing billionaire sector of the U.S. elite and allied racists to adjust to the tectonic economic, military, and technological changes of the emerging multipolar era. They are doing their best to maintain and expand their privileges and power in this changing period. 80 years ago, when the U.S. emerged as the world's dominant power, its nation was 4% of the world's population, but possessed 50% of global wealth. It had the most advanced conventional military forces, the nuclear weapon, which it had used. As European nations and Japan rebuilt their economies, as China brought 600 million people out of poverty, and with the demise of colonialism, the U.S. share of global GDP fell by half to about 24%. These changes have had immense impacts on what can and cannot be spent to develop and deploy so-called advanced murderous militaries, as well as a number of engineers and scientists that the U.S. can produce. Thus, even before the publication of the strategy, Trump and his minions were demanding that NATO allies increase their military spending to 5% of GDP, while making related demands of their Indo-Pacific allies. And in the tradition of the Nixon Doctrine, they were insisting that allies sacrifice their warriors as much or more than the United States in warfare. Other forces have also been at play. Witness the emergence of the Global South as a powerful force. South Africa had the temerity to challenge the Western-assisted Israeli genocide in Gaza, as well, in the International Court of Justice. I mean, that's a major turning point in human history. The BRICS are contesting the U.S. economic and monetary dominance, and the Emirates, the small little countries, have emerged as a powerful force with leverage over Trump and now even Venezuela. The Trump strategy is painful to read. It reeks of white supremacist rhetoric and policy commitments. It is rife with braggadocio designed to win U.S. popular support, and it flies in the face of observable reality. For example, it boasts of having obliterated Iran's nuclear program, even as Trump is now sending an armada with a demand that they take full control over it, as well as his ridiculous claim to have ended 8 wars. Analysts and foreign leaders were stunned by the strategy's bold declaration of the end of Pax Americana and the confession that U.S. global hegemony is, quote, fundamentally undesirable and impossible goal. Richard Haass, formerly the president of the Liberal Council on Foreign Relations, declared that the strategy is, quote, the biggest redirection of U.S. foreign policy since the end of World War II and the dawn of the Cold War. Russians say it's consistent with their vision. European leaders have panicked, and Chinese see the new U.S. military and economic priorities as the consequence of U.S. post-Cold War hegemonic failures, the disastrous imperial wars, U.S. economic fragility, and social and political fragmentation. This country is seriously divided. Walden Bello, who I trust many of you know, described the strategy as a compromise document negotiated between 3 forces in Trump's coalition. Maximalists who still cling to the dream of American dominance, specifists led by Eldridge Colby at the Pentagon, and his allies who, quote, believe America must retreat from Europe and the Middle East to focus single-mindedly on China, and third, continentalists or neo-Monroeists led by Stephen Miller, absolute horrible human being, and Vice President Vance, quote, who advocate an almost hermit-like retrenchment, turning the U.S. into a fortress continent. In Europe, German Chancellor Merz recognized the strategy as the end of Pax Americana, and Carl Bildt, the former Swedish prime minister, warned that the strategy places the U.S. to the right of the extreme right in Europe. Think about that. The U.S. to the right of the extreme right in Europe. A chorus newly inspired by Carney sings that the West, as it used to be, no longer exists. That's true. The strategy has also sown panic among U.S. neoconservatives and liberal imperialists. And Applebaum remarked that it's, quote, hard to think of another great power ever abdicating its influence so quickly and publicly. The New York Times devoted an 8-page special opinion section arguing that the U.S. military has been overmatched by China and asserting that the strategy provides a path back to, quote, normalcy. That's frightening. Tragically, this newspaper of record joins with Trump in urging still greater military spending, focusing on creating greater AI and cyber warfare capabilities, and returning to the era when the Pentagon had 51 and not just 5 primary military contractors. On the subject of contradictions, while the strategy pledges to, quote, preposition to non-interventionism, Trump seems to bask in 19th century gunboat diplomacy. The naval flotilla deployed to Venezuela, and which remains there, is the largest since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we now have this even larger flotilla en route to the Middle East to coerce Iran. Foreign policy is almost always a dimension of domestic policy. The historian Heather Koch Richardson explains that the strategy is explicit in its goal of creating, quote, a white supremacist country, rejecting immigration and restoring, quote, Europe's white Christian civilization, uh, its self-confidence and Western identity. The strategy is also replete with dog whistles like, quote, restoration and reinvigoration of American spiritual and cultural health. That's to say, white, Christian, um, racist cultural health, and defending and preserving that civilization. Also has ridiculous stuff there about uh, supporting strong traditional families and raising healthy families, which is to oppose any kind of gender equality and allow for sexual identity to move as it does. Its featured goal is to, quote, establish full control over our borders, which is to say, keeping people from the global south out. Since the strategy's publication, Trump and his minions have forbidden visas to be issued to people from 75 countries. I mean, imagine that. With the deportations and visa bans, construction and agricultural industries are struggling with an absence of workers, and the country is being driven backward as universities and industries that depend on attracting the best and brightest from around the world are deprived of essential human capital. And fewer young workers means reduced financing for the aging society's social safety net. I mean, they're just driving the country down and backwards. So let me talk a bit about money. Soon after Donald Trump's reelection, a former senior U.S. arms control diplomat was asked what Trump's foreign policy priority would be. His answer? Trump's first, second, and third priorities would be doing all that he could to enrich himself and his family. Trump has succeeded in this regard. The New York Times reports that between cryptocurrency bribes and Ponzi schemes, Qatar's gift of a jumbo jet, licensing and other agreements, Trump and familia have personally raked in $1.5 billion in just his first year as president. Beyond Trump's personal corruption, we now have the country's most mercantile foreign policy in more than a century. Access to other nations' raw materials and markets are the priority. And in a break from 3 generations of foreign policy rhetoric, the strategy is explicit that human rights concerns will not be a factor that interferes with U.S. commercial interests. The Times put it well, reporting that, quote, the world as seen from the White House is a place where America can use its vast powers to make more money. The ostensible agenda is seeking balanced trade, access to resources, and protecting supply chains and reindustrialization. But Trump's devastating tariffs, which are increasing costs for Americans and are alienating much of the world, have not brought offshore manufacturing home. And while U.S. exports have not grown, despite Trump's tariffs, China's exports have grown to new and record levels. Okay, turning to geopolitics. The strategy claims that the U.S. seeks to maintain its primacy via balances of power and consolidating spheres of influence. Not that China is to have a sphere, and that Trump and Vance are doing their very best to alienate Europeans. Consistent with Trump's predecessors, we are to be reassured by the Trumpian commitment to building, quote, the world's most powerful, lethal, and technologically advanced military. Trump has called for a 50% increase in the already $1 trillion Pentagon budget. That's an increase by $500 billion. This is to modernize the U.S. military industrial base, to maintain the world's most deadly nuclear arsenal, and to divert hundreds of billions of dollars to military contractors to build Trump's Golden Dome missile defenses. These are systems that will never work, but could bankrupt future generations. And all of this while the U.S. defunds the United Nations and foreign aid on which millions of human lives have depended. The pivot to Asia and the Pacific, begun by Obama, remains at the center of U.S. military and economic policy. The so-called Monroe Doctrine, designed to reconsolidate U.S. Hemisphere hegemony, the tradition of the Monroe Doctrine, is to serve as a guarantee of a rich and stable base for U.S. Indo-Pacific and global competition with China. Media reports have concentrated on the strategy's economic and not military competition with China. In there, we read that the focus is on industrial policies, intellectual property theft, protecting supply chains, and access to minerals and rare earths, fentanyl, and Chinese propaganda and influence operations. You won't see there the Biden era confrontational rhetoric with China. Some believe that the strategy's strategic ambiguity about China was designed to ensure that our would-be monarch receives the adulation he believes is his due when he travels to the Middle Kingdom later this year. Kurt Campbell, the author of The Pivot Asia, has written of his doubts that this is a winning strategy, but he concedes that by keeping Xi off balance, it could work to the U.S. advantage. While China is no longer described as a peer competitor, the strategy advises that, quote, the Indo-Pacific will continue to be among the next century's key economic and geopolitical backgrounds, and we must successfully compete there, end quote. But like the magician who diverts our attention, media reports miss the U.S. imperial continuity dating back to Admiral Dewey's gunships in Manila Bay. Despite Trump's alliance allergies, the strategy asserts that, quote, President Trump is building alliances and strengthening partnerships in the Indo-Pacific that will be the bedrock of security and prosperity long into the future, end quote. Toward that end, the strategy stresses that the U.S. needs to maintain dominance over the first island chain that extends from South Korea through Japan, Taiwan, and the Philippines, and extending westward onto Australia. Instead of seeking regime change in Beijing, Trump and company reaffirmed their commitment to containing China by a balance of power dominance with the Indo-Pacific alliances. Highlighted are the Biden era. This is interesting because anything Biden-Obama is just totally rejected by the Trump people. But nonetheless, they hearken to the Quad, the U.S., Japan, South Korea, and India alliance, and AUKUS, Australian, British, and U.S. military cooperation. Allies are called on to increase their burden sharing and to move to burden shifting. That's an interesting word. Burden shifting means the willingness to sacrifice their troops in U.S. wars. And to ensure ally loyalty to Washington, the strategy calls for their collaborations in an economic group to ensure that they don't become subordinate to any competing power, which is to say China. How serious is the U.S. competition for primacy? Even as there are murmurs about a possible G2 arrangement, 2 weeks after the release of the strategy, U.S. nuclear-capable bombers joined Japanese warplanes in a show of force. This came just a day after Chinese and Russian bombers flew around western Japan to demonstrate Beijing's rage at Japanese Prime Minister Takachi's warning that Japan would defend Taiwan if it were attacked. Oops. 3 other U.S. military commitments to contain China are worth noting. To enforce U.S. deterrence of China, the strategy promises to build, quote, a military capable of denying aggression anywhere in the first island chain, close quote, and that the U.S. will not tolerate, quote, any unilateral change to the status quo in the Taiwan Strait. This, we are told, will require still greater U.S. military spending, including for expanding U.S. defense industry bases. We are informed that the U.S. will, quote, not tolerate a competitor, end quote, attempting to control the South China Sea, across which 1/3 of the world's trade travels. And third, after maintaining strategic ambiguity over U.S. commitments to Taiwan, the strategy observes that war there must be avoided because it would have, quote, major implications for the U.S. economy because the autonomous island provides direct access to the second island chain, which is to say Japan, Guam, and Micronesia. And loss of Taiwan would split Northeast and Southeast Asia into 2 theaters because, like the Philippines, it is a key to, quote, controlling the South China Sea. Thus, within days of the strategy's publication, Trump committed to selling Taiwan $11 billion of advanced military equipment to transform it into an unappetizing military porcupine. Here in the United States, we've had just lots of ink poured over the strategy's implications for Europe. Since 1945, Western Europe has functionally been a U.S. protectorate. When NATO was founded in 1949, the alliance's first Secretary General said that its purpose was to keep China out, Germany down, and the U.S. in. Now, after NATO's post-Cold War expansion to Russia's borders, Putin's invasion of Ukraine, and the re-election of a president more aligned with Russian authoritarianism than European social democracy, the strategy is clear that the U.S. will no longer guarantee Europe's security. Long subservient Europe must now make its way between the hammer and anvil of Russian military power and China's economic juggernaut. For Trump, Europe is valued only for trade, investment opportunities, and resources, as we see in Greenland. The strategy distances the U.S. from NATO and places the U.S. closer to Russia, which is seen as small economic, if not nuclear potatoes, compared with China. Moscow is a major nuclear power, but not an economic power. The strategy makes clear that despite its ambitions in Ukraine, or rather, despite Ukrainian ambitions, it cannot join NATO, something which neither Biden nor the most powerful U.S. allies, especially, say, Germany and France, have been willing to support. And as Trump insists that European NATO nations must take the lead in attending to their own defense, he simply offers to mediate between Europe and the Eastern powers, not to protect it. Worth noting, again, Walden Bellow, as a source, writes that this appears to include Russian suzerainty over Eastern Europe. We'll see how that plays out. Like Putin, Trump has no patience for democracy. By their very existence, European democracies pose a political and cultural threat to Trump and MAGNA pursuit of autocracy. Ideologically, as well as economically and militarily, a growing number of European leaders now experience the U.S. as, quote, a security threat. Even before the Greenland crisis over control of the island's mineral wealth and proximity to the Northwest Passage, Danish intelligence was advising that, quote, the United States uses economic power, including in the form of threats and high tariffs, to enforce its will and will no longer exclude the use of military force even against its allies. So watch out again in the Philippines. The strategy also commits Washington to support, quote, like-minded, which is to say racist and patriotic parties, the extreme right-wing and fascist forces across Europe. It warns that Europe faces a white Christian civilization erasure, necessitating the U.S. to support, quote-unquote, resistance. There were intimations of this policy transformation in Vice President Vance's, I mean, I just hate to say those words, Vice President Vance, in his Munich Security Conference speech a year ago. We saw it there in his support for the fascist Alternative for Germany party and his administration's embrace of Orban in Hungary, Meloni in Italy, and Le Pen in France. Getting there, friends. In response to the fragility of U.S. commitments to NATO, European elites are turning, perhaps futilely, to create a more unified European military, either to reinforce NATO or potentially and in time to create an independent power. Pressure is on to create an integrated European military-industrial complex and to increase the number of troops under arms. Conscription and other forms of voluntary enlistment, which is not to say that conscription is voluntary, are being reintroduced. The number of tank forces and warplanes are being increased, and AI and cybersecurity capabilities are being increased. Germany again seeks to become the continent's major land power, which, remembering history, is something not to be embraced. Off camera, diplomacy is quietly continuing to determine whether French or British nuclear weapons might replace the U.S. nuclear umbrella. Okay, Global South. Beyond the signaling of the end of the 80-year transatlantic alliance, media reports have shared the shock of the Trump corollary to the two-century-old Monroe Doctrine, a naked recommitment to U.S. Western hemispheric neocolonialism and hegemony. The U.S. Central European and African commands are to be downgraded and integrated into a new international command, with the transfer of some forces to the Western Hemisphere, and we can expect also to the Indo-Pacific. Thus, naval forces and thousands of troops were redeployed from Europe to Venezuelan waters. Terrorism, originating in the Middle East, is no longer a major security concern. Since Trump bowed to Saudi monarchs in the opening months of his first term, and his son-in-law took $2 billion as a going-away president, Trump and his family have been wed to the Saudi monarchy and to Persian Gulf Emirates. We saw Qatar's influence when it forced the White House to impose an Israeli-Hamas ceasefire in the wake of Israel's assassination of Hamas's lead negotiator in Doha. While Trump claims that Venezuela has stolen our oil under its soil, neither Trump nor Hegseth have yet to claim our oil under Middle East sands. Instead, Saudi Arabia and the Emirates are described as a source and destination of international investment, including nuclear energy, AI, and military technologies. Consequently, not unlike China, the strategy rejects previous commitments to encourage social and political change in the Middle East, although Iran appears to be an exception these days. The strategy claims to accept the region, its leaders, and nations as they are, quote. It commits the U.S. to, quote, prevent an adversarial power from dominating the Middle East, its oil and gas supplies, which is to say Iran or China. In order to do so, it pledges, quote, revitalization of our alliances in the Gulf with other Arab partners and with Israel. Along these lines, it celebrates U.S. collaborations with Israel, but it does not name Trump's complicity in the Gaza genocide, or that Israel or his own missile attacks on Iran's nuclear infrastructure came in the midst of negotiations with Tehran. When it comes to Africa, the strategy has little to say about what Trump once described as shithole countries. It looks to select countries to ameliorate conflict, as it says, as it seeks to, quote, foster mutually beneficial trade relations, which is to say getting resources and market. The goal is to, quote, harness Africa's abundant natural resources and latent economic potential. So much for the end of the colonial exploitation. So where to from here? There is an obvious need for solidarity and collaborations by peace and justice forces in the U.S., Philippines, and across the Indo-Pacific. Clearly, a lot depends on whether democratic forces here in the U.S. can overcome the Trump MAGA unconstitutional tyranny. But given the power of the military-industrial complex and the history of the Democratic Party here, with their wars and imperial shenanigans, even if we succeed, we will have much more to do. Proverbs tells us that, quote, a people without a vision will perish. It thus behooves us to provide alternate visions of what real security for the U.S., the Philippines, and other peoples and nations is, and how to achieve it. Given the urgent existential threats that we face, my list begins with the non-utopian paradigm that served as the foundation for the end of the First Cold War. That was the concept of common security diplomacy, which recognizes that security cannot be achieved against a rival, but only through difficult win-win diplomacy with competing nations. It has been observed that China has been able to take 600 million people out of poverty and to create what is fast becoming the world's most advanced infrastructure, in large measure because it has not wasted lives, wealth, and resources in wars for almost half a century. Defending constitutional democracy and electing a U.S. government committed to providing housing, health, food, and justice here in the United States, but obviously elsewhere as well, are essential places to begin. And we must recognize there is no going back to those so-called good old days that never really existed. Our work is before us. It's a dangerous time, but together I think we can do a lot. So thank you for your patience, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Joseph. We're just gonna wait on the interpretation in Tagalog before we start the Q&A. Oh,
I'm even more long-winded in Tagalog than I am in English.
all right. So that was quite a revelation for some of us who have not been able to monitor the that the Trump administration came out with the U.S. National Security Strategy last November 2025. Um, of course, we heard a whole lot, and maybe we would like to ask our participants here. Uh, can you give me a thumbs up if you think that small nations are at risk? And can you give me a heart? I don't know. I'll check the make my heart. Yeah. Make a heart if you think solidarity is the answer. So I'm just gonna wait. Yeah. All right. We're getting very good responses. Thanks. Okay. So we got a couple of comments in the chat and questions. I'll just get right into that. Someone asked, yes, just keep the hearts going because we all know that if enough of us band together, we can make great changes and move the world to uh, somewhere we're not. Because currently we're 72% of the global population is under authoritarianism. So we're there. Right. So, okay. So for questions, we have a couple. So to Joseph, what is the real plan with the peace board? I guess it means the Gaza peace board. Is the US or Trump making this a replacement of the UN Security Council? Or is the peace board just a business deal?
I think the answer is that it's both. It's clearly a business deal over who gets access to Gaza, not so much its people, but its beachfront, and to create it into a piggy bank for Trump and the Gulf, the wealthiest in the Gulf. Interestingly, Russia is also invited to the peace board, and I think this signals the goal of the extreme right here to ultimately replace the United Nations. Back in Trump's first term, his national security advisor said that if they removed the top 10 floors of the United Nations, it would make no difference to the world. And we have a long history of right-wing opposition under the idea that the concept that the United States has to be sovereign. Of course, that sovereignty extends all over the world. So the U.S. can make what decisions it wants, regardless of the UN. I think also we need to face the reality that the structure of the UN, created now 80 years ago, has profound flaws, and the UN may be approaching a period not unlike that in the 1920s, when the League of Nations began to unravel and fall apart. So Trump is making this this challenge at a time when the UN is increasingly fragile. In the structure with the Security Council, which has the ultimate veto power, and the contending great power tensions and threats, the Security Council has been unable to prevent or end wars. In fact, its members are engaging in such wars, and major powers like Japan, like uh, the Saudis, you name it, other nuclear powers, India, Pakistan, are not in the Security Council on a permanent basis. And so major decisions can't be made. And the great powers refuse to modify the structure of the UN. They want to hold on to their power as long as they can.
Okay, I think I have another question, but a bit related to that. So another person asked, um, after Trump's term ends, will the United States continue the same strategy? I guess referring to what is written in the NSS, or shift its global approach? Are these changes driven mainly by Trump or by deeper economic and social pressures within the United States? So I guess maybe a little insight on how's the real deal over there.
Right. So first of all, I think we have to be careful with our use of Trump's name, because while he does exercise near monarchical power, he is in some ways the figurehead for, as I said in my talk, a clique of right-wing billionaires, many of them in high tech, but others as well. Um, so, were Trump um, to die or not return to office, this force, this power, this clique will still be there. Whether they'll be able to exercise, and also just to recognize there are some divisions. I mean, we've got Trump, rather, we've got Vance and Rubio with some fairly serious differences, and what they would do if they actually had power. They largely continue on the lines that we've got, but with some differences. The question is, if we're able to overcome Trump MAGA rule, what will follow? And my guess is to be the biggest changes would come domestically. I mean, what they're doing domestically here in the United States is a horror. Think here in terms of vaccines, think here in terms of budgetary commitments, housing, basic human rights. We would see serious amelioration in those areas. Internationally, I think we'd see something like, look, the Democratic Party is in a war with itself, right? You've got progressives aligned with with Democratic Socialists, Mondani, AOC, Bernie, and others. And were they to come to power, we would see, I think, a serious change in U.S. Foreign and military policies. For the most part, these people are really pretty good. But we also have the traditional corporate-oriented Democrats. And my guess is that after a struggle to overcome tyranny here, that these liberal forces would exercise the greatest part of power. I think there's a recognition across the boards that the world has changed. I mean, as Carney and others have said, we're not going back. The world has changed, and we have to adjust our strategies and our visions for the future accordingly. It has changed. Pax Americana, there's a global domination is over. Other forces have arisen. China, the global South, and even liberal forces would make accommodations, but the assumption of U.S. primacy would remain, and that's a challenge for us.
Okay, so I have a couple of questions on related to um China, but before I ask that, you talked about uh, the Golden Dome, that idea, and then you also talked about spheres of influence. Does that actually I have like two questions. First, why do you think that it's not going to be feasible or viable, that idea of a Golden Dome? Second, um, do you think that because we're talking about spheres of influence, uh, the United States will allow a certain way of uh, acting for its rivals, as long as it's not dislodged? For instance, in Europe and China in the Asia, Russia for Europe and then China for Asia and the Americas.
Right. So first, in terms of the Golden Dome, some people remember Ronald Reagan's Star Wars. The idea that you could put up an impenetrable shield over the United States that would protect the U.S. people from that point, a Soviet attack. And as was noted at the time, it means hitting a bullet with a bullet in space. And anybody with their head on their shoulders understood that wouldn't work. The same applies to the Golden Dome. In a period of accelerating velocity of missiles, the ability to deploy dummy warheads and so on. I was in a meeting of the Arms Control Association a few months ago, and its head, its leader, Tom Countryman, said, "You know, look, I've spoken to a lot of physicists, and they all say this can't work. It won't work." And you know what? China and Russia also have physicists. So I think the best way to understand the Golden Dome is as a boondoggle, a way to further enrich the U.S. military-industrial complex, to enrich, the people who profit from that system, and which will further impoverish the U.S. people and weaken it. In terms of what the United States will accept in relationship to China and Russia, I think that's an open question. And clearly there are divisions within the Trump MAGA government. So it's been interesting to watch how tensions within the government, within the U.S. government, has played out, say, in relationship to the Ukraine war. And walking back frequently a number of Trump's most um, biggest threatened gifts to Russia at the expense of Ukraine and Europe. So I think those tensions are going to play out, and uh, we don't know quite how much Trump can embrace Putin. We'll just have to see how that plays out. In relationship to China, again, you've got divisions in Trump MAGA government. Um, those like Vance, who basically want to create a fortress Western Hemisphere, are probably quite willing to move to a G2 arrangement uh, with China. The degree to which they would be willing to open the way for Chinese control, say, of the Philippines is an open question. One of the things we see uh, in relationship to fears around this has been the steady buildup of Japan's military. As with Europeans, building their military power within the umbrella, within the structures that have existed. In Japan's case, the U.S.-Japan Military Alliance, AMPO. But and as I mentioned in my speech, the increasing Japanese-Philippine military relations, but also Japanese-Indian, Japanese-Australian. So they're hedging against a time when the U.S. might pull back. At the same time, you've got forces like Colby and others who insist on continued U.S. Hegemony across the Indo-Pacific, even if they can't control what goes on in China. I have to say, the contradictions are so great. I'm amazed at the way that I don't like Modi in India at all. I mean, he's another wannabe dictator. But the U.S. since the Clinton years has been trying to engage India as a source to counterbalance China. And what do we have? Massive tariffs on India, which will affect its economy and driving it quite literally into China's arms. So we'll see how that plays.
Okay, so since you ended in Asia and China, these two questions are, or three, are related to China. So the first is, the Asia pivot is about containing China. Perhaps the national security strategy is also mainly about stopping China's rapid super development. So that's the first one. And another, this is actually a question from Prof. Roland. Is there a risk for any of the small nations to be embroiled in proxy wars between China and the United States, the ways wars happened after World War II?
Yeah, so again, one loves the contradictions. So clearly, the goal of the strategy is to limit China's economic as well as military rise. And we've seen this play out, with a number of the tariffs. At the same time, uh, Trump has never particularly respected what's put in writing. And we had the surprise of his agreement to sell NVIDIA chips to China, which would be important for both its economic and military development. Two questions arise here. One, they did not approve the selling of the most advanced chips. I mean, beyond what anything I can imagine. And on the other hand, there's the question of how many will really be authorized to go. So we have to see how that plays. But there are concerns within Trump's right-wing base that he may be giving too much away to China. And we'll see how that plays. In terms of small nations being embroiled in a possible war, I mean, I think, Taiwan is the hinge of all this, right? The reality is that if China is able to reunify with Taiwan, and the U.S. is marginalized in that regard, the global empire is seriously wounded. In terms of U.S. status across the Indo-Pacific and internationally, it would be powerfully weakened. There is the question of who gets the semiconductors. So there's that. Um, I was at an interesting conference where it was argued actually by Taiwanese pollster and others that Taiwan would lose the war in the first day. And the reality is that while the majority of people in Taiwan want to at least maintain their autonomy, if not develop independence, very few are willing to sacrifice their lives for that. So the expectation told to us by several Taiwanese is that they would lose the war in the first day. A quick Chinese victory would keep other Asian nations from having to come into it. Although we have the commitment by Japan and the strategic ambiguity, threats, and political forces here in the United States behind maintaining Taiwan's autonomy, that could lead them quite quickly into a war. Once that happens, among others, the Philippines is a strategic base. There's a military alliance. We have a history, say, from Vietnam, of expecting Asian partners to sacrifice their lives in illegitimate wars. So I don't think that any nation in the Indo-Pacific would be able to insulate itself from the war. And of course, its impacts, its ramifications would be global.
Right. So, is it fair to say that the U.S. is shifting from soft power to more reliance towards hard power? And can this be, as you said, a indication of its decline as an empire vis-a-vis China?
So it's very clear that Trump does not have much respect for soft power, right? He's into dominance. He's into the exercise of hard power, not only internationally but here within the United States as well. Witness the troops in Minneapolis, for example. Um, and yeah, I mean it's been shocking. I mean, everybody's been shocked by the end of the health and other aid given to countries in the global South, which really not only saved lives, but gave the United States a much better reputation, one that didn't necessarily deserve. Um, so yeah, the commitment here is to brutal hard power. You just saw that in Venezuela. We're seeing it in Iran. We see it with the commitment to increase U.S. military spending by 50%. Does this reflect imperial decline? Absolutely. You can't spend $1.5 trillion a year on a military uh, and uh, and be providing the foundations for education, for health, and the rest. So, we're in a period of accelerating decline of the United States. We're seeing a group of people who see the reduction of U.S. global power is inevitable and are therefore doing what they can to consolidate their privilege and power within this change. Um, I don't expect that the U.S. will cease to become an empire. But the reality is this, I think I said, I mean, with what's being spent on research, the assaults on universities, and so on, this only opens the way for greater Chinese influence and comparative rise against the United States. Some like Paul Krugman, the Nobel Prize economist, have written that China has already won the economic competition with the United States for primacy. And I think he's probably right, which is not to say that China doesn't have its own flaws, which it does, among them being social divisions that Xi is doing his best to tamp down, the uh, assault on human rights, and the demographic problem that China has with an aging population and a reducing birth rate that's greater than the United States. It does have still 1.4 billion people, so it's going to be a major force for all the time.
Right. So earlier you talked about burden shifting. Well,
Mm.
another term for burden sharing as contained in the NSS. Do you see, particularly for Japan, Korea, Australia, a greater reliance for nuclear power?
Mm.
Because it's worrying for us because these are like practically our neighbors,
Yeah.
and even our government is, showing signs that it's welcoming small modular reactors here.
Yeah. So first of all, just to clarify the difference between burden sharing and burden shifting. Burden sharing here is understood as money. Pay
Okay.
for pay for the militaries. Burden shifting means people dying from other countries as they join the United States in its wars, sharing the bloodshed. And we've had some of this in the past, but more is wanted as U.S. power declines, and there's really not a whole lot I mean, it's interesting to watch uh, conservatives here being opposed to a war with Iran, for example. With the series of failed post-Cold War wars, the enthusiasm for war is not what it used to be here. In terms of, and also just to say now, with the burden sharing, and I guess also the burden shifting. we're seeing especially Japan as a rising military power. It's interesting Takachi and her political allies in the current election campaign are again pressing very hard for revision of Japan's constitution. And basically, the constitution has been ignored for the last 30 years or more. Constitution which says that Japan will not have a military and forswears a possible war. We've seen, the growing Japanese joint military operations with the U.S. and other countries, the exercises and so on, and a real commitment to reemerge as power. One of the things that surprised me, I read this morning, I think, that they're looking at changing the titles for its military officers back to what they were at the time of Japan's brutal imperial wars in the 30s and 40s. And so harkening back to that period. What we see is that, to a degree, encouraged by Trump and the fortress people here, in South Korea, people there concerned about that the U.S. would not defend them against North Korea or China. The majority of people in South Korea now want to have nuclear weapons, and you have growing discussions about this in Japan. I have to say, 30 years ago, to my surprise, I ended up interviewing the man responsible for writing Japan's military policies. And in that interview, he said that it had been the um, uh, policy of the Japanese military that they have the right to possess tactical nuclear weapons, which is to say Hiroshima-sized nuclear weapon, that it was simply a right they had yet to exercise. And we see in Japan growing discussions about the need to examine whether they should become a nuclear power. On nuclear power generation, yes, I mean, we're seeing an effort in the wake of, really global resistance to nuclear power and the catastrophic nuclear accidents. Catastrophic pressures to build uh, more nuclear generators, including the mobile versions. Here in my state of Massachusetts, where we have a Democratic governor, a conservative one, I'd say, she's pushing very hard for these. Uh, with the data centers and the increased demands for electricity, they're wondering where they're going to get their power to fuel these new technologies, and this is what they're looking to. But again, anything nuclear carries with it dangers, and we need to, I think, be pressing for use of sustainable energy.
Okay, let me just read one comment in the chat and ask our friends for the last round of questions. So someone said the people of the US, I believe that the US would not be able to consolidate its hold over the Western Hemisphere or even just the Latin America and the Caribbean. The people of the United States are now the decisive force to end not only Trump's dictatorship, but more so the hegemonistic, design of the USA's elite. Yeah. What do you think of
Well,
that?
I wish that were entirely the case. I think we need to have deep concerns about what Rubio and Trump are planning for Cuba. The goal of the Venezuelan decapitation, I mean, they didn't eliminate the regime. They simply decapitated it and are moving to make it yield to U.S. demands. They've cut off the oil shipments to Cuba, on which it has from Venezuela, on which it's been dependent, and this signals, I think, profound suffering to the Cuban people. What would follow beyond that, I don't know. I mean, I think the Trump approach here is not to invade Cuba, but just to strangle it. Interestingly, the polls seem to indicate, I hate to say it, that most Latin American leaders welcomed the ouster of Maduro. And you do have growing right-wing forces in Latin America, witness Chile among others, for example. But you do have resistance. I mean, you look particularly to Lula in Brazil, and we'll see how that plays out. The other piece that's there is that Carney's speech, his trip to China, signals that they're not going to take U.S. coercion lying down, and that they're going to look to develop other ways to circumvent U.S. efforts at coercion. But it's a struggle that goes on, and we can read again. To my surprise, there's a secessionist movement in Alberta, the province, western province in Canada, aligned or committed to trying to become a 51st U.S. state. And in Quebec, there will soon be going to the polls. It's a francophone country, and again, the U.S. might encourage its breakup. We'll have to see. I have on order a hat which says Canada is, and that says Greenland is not for sale. And it's interesting, and I really love seeing the degree of resistance there. So we'll have to see how it plays out. I don't think anything is spelled out in stone. Everything is dynamic, and as we know from U.S. and Philippine history, it's the people who make the future.
All right. So let's just pause for a bit and let me just ask our friends here in the room. A key theme emerging that we're talking about is dependency and risk. If the Philippines is a frontline state, what narratives can we build to resist militarization and affirm sovereignty? So I'm going to ask you guys to drop an emoji in the chat, worried face, an angry face, or is it a raised fist, or a dove for peace? So hashtag no to militarization, hashtag sovereignty now. So while I'm waiting for you to drop the emojis on me, we're going to launch our second poll. Yeah. So the question now is, yes, which impact of the island chain strategy worries you the most? Is it militarization, dependency, conflict, or sovereignty? Again, I'm waiting on your emojis or your fists or doves. I guess yeah. Okay. Wow, really, the poll says it all. So we have the people here now are more worried about militarization. A close second is conflict, and of course the uh, implications to sovereignty, especially of small nations like the Philippines. So just one more minute for anybody else who wants to vote. Yeah. All right. So we have heard a whole lot of uh groundbreaking information, I guess, for some of us who are hearing this for the first time, or at least validation for some of us who have been closely following this issue as it impacts a small nation like the Philippines. So we've heard that militarization and especially the transactional nature of the United States deals at this point are intensifying, and small nations are facing heightened risks of dependency and conflict. And we see that the Philippines is uniquely positioned, or is that fortunately or unfortunately? Unfortunately, I think, based on our sentiment here, it is positioned as a frontline state at the first island chain strategy. And of course, we know that grassroots communities will bear the brunt of this decision by our government, especially with talks that there would be more security deals in the future for the Philippines, and there will be more an increase of budget for the Philippines in the coming days. We also see that we would need to empower our grassroots narratives of peace, sovereignty, and solidarity as tools to resist and reframe. Okay, so if you can use the hashtag story shape action and hashtag communities resist. So for our final poll, before we ask Joseph for his last words to our forum, what narratives should grassroots movements emphasize the most? Is it peace, sovereignty, solidarity, or resistance? Okay, let's wait for our friends to vote. Wow, the third poll is really hot. The votes just keep coming in. All right, and we have a winner. Oh, no, they're still voting. Let's just wait a 2 more minutes. All right. So now we have our answers. It's solidarity. Our top answer actually is resistance, followed by solidarity, sovereignty, and of course, peace. So I guess that we're hoping that our conversations of uh, more an alternative narrative for security, as mentioned by Joseph, as really needs to be really, we need to really double down on that, how we define what real security is, especially with this uh, threat looming on us as the Asia continent and as Philippines, the country in this part of the world. So let me just give this opportunity for Joseph to say a few words. His last, I guess, his last word for us for this forum. Please note that this is not, hopefully, this is not the last time that we will invite Joseph Person here on board the Phil Initiative learning sessions. Joseph, you have the floor.
Thank you, DJ. And let me just begin by appreciating the wisdom and the skill that you've brought to this session. I've really enjoyed working with you, and I want to say that. Um, I don't know that I have any great great wisdom to add here. I'm aware that just as life here in the United States is pretty demanding these days, it's not exactly a bowl of cherries in the Philippines either. And so I want to appreciate the commitments of people on this call, and to wish you the best as you struggle for democracy, human rights, and peace in the Philippines as well. Um, uh, and I guess just to say that, with my limited experience with the Philippine movement, I've been greatly impressed by the commitments and spirit that you bring. And I know from, I mean, I'm not a kid anymore. I'm an old character here. And so I know from my experiences along the way that solidarity and cooperation, thinking together, acting together is really quite critical to building the world that we want. And feel myself privileged to be working with you and look forward to being able to do it in the future. Wishing everybody on this call health and courage. You're muted. DJ, you're muted.
Yeah, okay. Thanks. So before we log off, can we show some love to our guest and the resource person, Joseph Gerson? Can we show the either the clap sign or the heart sign, right? So, comrades, we're joined in this call by YNDNCR, Area Progresivo, YND Bataan, Kilusan Bataan. Professor Roland Simbulan is also with us, the Human Rights Campaign, Pakistan, World Beyond War Asia. We are also joined by Pangista Pilipinas, Asia People's Forum, our friends there, Young Workers League, Peace Women Partners, ICU, and Lorena Kaisaka, NCR. We also, before I say my last bit, thank the hard work of our friends who made this all possible. Our interpreters, Cora and Aya Clamor, Cora Fabros and Aya Clamor, and also the amazing International Peace Bureau team, Emily, Michelle, and Sean, who held the helm for us for this 1 hour and a half experience. You probably didn't notice that it was like 1 hour and a half. We have like the last 4 seconds now. So, comrades, we are facing really a slew of, as Joseph said, it's not a jar of bowl of cherries here. Whether we're in the United States or over here in Asia. So we see ballooning budgets and we see the mushrooming of new bases here, whether they acknowledge it or not, they are being used as bases by foreign militaries, particularly the allies of the United States. And we are going to be in the thick of things here in Asia. And the choice now is we have the challenge of trying to step up our collective action for towards a more urgent push of the narrative of peace, of solidarity, of resistance, no, in the face of the threats of militarization to us. And of course, for the last interaction, I would like to ask our friends, after this last interaction, we're just going to take a quick photo, okay? So let me just ask our friends to drop a raised fist if it's resistance, drop a dove if it's peace, and drop a handshake if it's solidarity. So right. So I'm gonna wait for on that on you. And then again, we'd like to thank you all and remind you that it's gonna be streamed in YouTube. We're going to share the link later on. Right. So again, we're gonna do a quick photo, guys. Somebody. So our friends who are in a hub, again, can you just like very quickly open your cams? Okay. Cue us, Miss Cora. Give the cue if you're okay. You're muted. Oh, I mean, you're in the interpretation channel. Oh no, I can't hear. Okay, just give me a sign if we're good. So we take a photo in 3, 2, 1. Okay, we're good. Yes, thank you so much again. Thank you, folks.